anything down. Okay. So, right, section C. So this is the session on politics and society, natural law and the gospel. We'll proceed as these have all been going. Each speaker has 30 minutes. The goal is 20 minutes of presentation, which I did not meet, so don't worry. But then whatever's not left of the 30 minutes is what's left for, or whatever is left of the 30 minutes is Q&A. And then, of course, we do 15 minutes as a panel at the end. So, in terms of what you do, Sister Anne, I will let you introduce yourself. But the first speaker is Sister Anne Astell, a colleague of mine on the 3rd floor of Malloy, cherished colleague, professor of theology, University of Notre Dame. Came originally, and probably still does, a kind of theology informed by art and poetry, which is quite good, and I value very much. And she will be speaking on Aquinas on the question of military orders, warfare, soldiering, and preaching. I did not know that. That should be in here. So,
That's great.
do you remember the name? What's the name of it? So, an endowed chair by someone very generously providing from their wealth what is justly due. And as I used to say when I directed the Maritain Center, pray for our donors.
Thank you, John. All right. This paper is indebted to my teaching of an undergraduate class, Saints in the Theology of Warfare, where we read an article from the Summa. So, here we go. In the Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae, question 188, Article 3, Aquinas addresses the question, can a religious order be directed to soldiering? Aquinas has in mind the relatively new military orders, such as the Templars, which, as envisioned by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, pursued Christian perfection in a manner combining monastic prayer, asceticism, and charitable intention with active soldiering in the Holy Land. The issue for Aquinas emerges in the context of several questions concerning the diversities of life, active and contemplative. That's in questions 179 to 82, and the varieties of the states of life, questions 183 to 89. Aquinas' positive answer to the question about the possibility of military orders in Article 3 of question 188 recalls both his immediately preceding answer concerning the orders of the active life in Article 2 and his earlier conclusions in question 29 of the second part, and question 40 on peace and war, concerning the virtue of charity, charity's acts, and the vices opposed to charity's acts. According to Thomas, a just war must be a peaceful war, one that is not only authorized by proper authority and prompted by a just cause, but also motivated by the rightful intention of the belligerents, whose sincere goal is peace rather than worldly gain for themselves or cruel revenge. Augustine had taught that peace is the proper end of all war. Distinguishing between peace and concord, Aquinas adds that peace is also the proper form of the belligerent's soul, wherein all the appetitive movements are set at rest together in charity. Peace is the unity of the soul's inclinations and the wellspring of its peacemaking, even peacemaking through warfare. Aquinas' approbation of the idea of military orders generally concurs with his teaching on just war as an external act of charity in defense of others. But it also lays a groundwork for his answer in question 188, Article 4, can an order be established for the purpose of preaching? The effect of these linkages is to envision the order of preachers as engaged in charitable, active works against spiritual foes that parallel the charitable, active works of soldiers, such as the Knights Templar, against physical foes. Preaching pertains to the active life. Since preaching cannot be accomplished virtuously without a prior contemplation, however, Aquinas famously argues in Article 6 for the superiority of a mixed life of contemplation and action to which the Dominicans and Franciscans both aspired. Treating the military orders as active orders and ordained to physical defense rather than as orders of the mixed life, as St. Bernard had implicitly envisioned them, Aquinas claims for the mendicant orders in Article 6 a superiority over both contemplatives, the monks, and practitioners of the active life, soldiers. Even if St. Thomas were to acknowledge the members of the military orders to be living a mixed life, an acknowledgement he hesitates to make, he would surely argue that the mixed life of the mendicant preachers is a higher calling than that of the military orders, because the charitable work of preaching is a spiritual work, whereas the charitable work of fighting is corporeal, answering to the need for the physical defense of vulnerable persons and holy places. Thomas makes exactly this point in Article 4, which builds upon Articles 2 and 3. Quote, "It's a greater thing to employ spiritual arms in defending the faithful against the errors of heretics and the temptations of the devil than to protect the faithful by means of bodily weapons," unquote. Were he to describe the military orders as mixed instead of active, he would also surely argue that the degree to which the members of the military orders engage in the contemplative life is much less than that which is incumbent upon preachers, whose lives are directed to passing on to others what they have received in contemplation. He does acknowledge in Article 2, in the reply to Objection 1, however, that members of active orders, quote, "are not entirely deprived of the fruit of the contemplative life," unquote. And indeed, quote, "since religious occupy themselves with the works of the active life for God's sake, it follows that their action results from the contemplation of divine things," unquote. As Thomas understands it, the members of the active orders are in the world as to the presence of the body, but they are not in the world as regards the bent of mind. In other words, the members of the active orders at work in the world all have a bent of mind, a charitable intention for God and neighbor that is fundamentally contemplative, because it is an outflow of the daily contemplative practices that inspire their active charitable works. The whole discussion of the mendicant life as a mixed life, wherein the contemplative life finds its charitable end in active preaching, thus establishes a framework for later 14th century developments, when a spiritual classic like Walter Hilton's Mixed Life taught the devout laity to regard their active vocation as educators of their children, for example, as a combination of contemplation and action. It also fueled already ongoing discussions about the members of the older monastic orders, about the mixed character of their own calling to prayer and work, both within the limits of the monastery and extending into parishes. Already in the 12th century, after all, Rupert of Deutz and his fellow Benedictines had vigorously defended the right of monks to preach in the churches, as the missionary monks of old had done, and to engage more broadly in pastoral care, as did the canons regular in various regions. Succeeding centuries would see medieval monks and canons attending universities and teaching both there and in monastery schools. Amidst the historical proliferation of new orders, including his own, St. Thomas defended their right to exist as distinct entities, despite their formal resemblance as commonly vowed to poverty, chastity, and obedience. He did so principally by distinguishing between the remote end of all the orders, namely Christian perfection in charity and the visio beata of God in heaven, on the one hand, and the immediate end of a particular order's God-given primary task or mission in this earthly life, on the other. Quote, since, however, the end imports most in every matter, religious orders differ more especially according to their various ends than according to their various practices. Thomas cites in support of this claim a sentence from Abbot Nesteros from the Conferences of the Fathers. Quote, some direct their intention exclusively to the hidden life of the desert and purity of heart. Some are occupied with the instruction of the brethren and the care of the monasteries, while others delight in the service of the guest house, that is, in hospitality, unquote. This list returns us to the question of the possibility of a military order, understood as a religious order, given its immediate end in conducting warfare. In the 13th century, this was still a relatively new question, a genuine question, and not without controversy. As A.J. Foley instructs us, the Order of the Temple, initially founded circa 1119 for the protection of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, and later enlisted to buttress Christian forces fighting against Muslim warriors, was the first foundation of this kind. The primitive rule of the Templars closely mirrors the rule of St. Benedict and reflects already existing practices among the knights. It was approved in 1128 at the Council of Troyes. St. Bernard pointedly called it a new knighthood, a nova militiae genus, and contrasted it with a familiar old kind of worldly knighthood, tainted by malicia, the wicked pursuit of vainglory, power, and wealth through violence. Foley argues convincingly that the establishment of such a military order within the Christian world was made possible by a changed evaluation of war itself, thanks to the papal call for the First Crusade and the theological justifications given for it. Crusaders were promised the remission of sins, the possibility of dying a martyr's death, and of meriting salvation through what they charitably endured and renounced as soldiers. Within this changed context, the wide gap, which had earlier separated the religious form from the military way of life, no longer existed. The traditional metaphorical description of the monk as a miles Christe, engaged in the spiritual defense of God's people through his prayer, obedience, and asceticism, could also be applied literally to a knight of the temple. St. Bernard characterizes Jesus himself as a prototypical knight, cleansing the temple with the weapons of the cord whip he used to defend it as the Father's house of prayer. In his praise of the new knighthood, Bernard first draws a sharp contrast between the Templars and worldly secular knights, laying particular emphasis on the Templars' charitable intention, renunciation of worldly goods, monastic discipline, and readiness to die for Christ and Christ's church a martyr's death on the battlefield. In chapter 5, The Temple of Jerusalem, Bernard meditates on how the Templars, who have occupied the Temple Mount, resemble Christ in their zeal for the holiness of God's house. The remaining chapters meditate one by one on other holy places in the Holy Land, and thus implicitly underscore the idea that the Templars are fundamentally pilgrims and the protectors of pilgrims. St. Thomas was surely familiar with St. Bernard's famous treatise in praise of the new knighthood, but he does not cite it directly, nor does he name Bernard as a source for any of the responses given in question 188. This is in itself somewhat surprising, since Thomas and Bernard are in fundamental agreement about the legitimacy of military orders, and it invites inquiry concerning what leads Thomas to distance himself implicitly from Bernard, whose argumentative context was distinct from Thomas's own. Bernard wanted to defend the novelty of the Templars as knights by likening them to monks and their rule to the long-accepted monastic rule. Thomas, in turn, was moving in the opposite direction. He was widening the perceived gap between the monastic and the military orders as contemplative and active orders, respectively, in order to defend the novelty and the superiority of the mixed life of the mendicant orders. Whereas Bernard's praise of the new knighthood associates the charitable perfection of that calling with an ecstasy of martyrdom, necessarily entailing a pure-hearted contemplation, Thomas, as we shall see, treats the individual soldier's potential martyrdom as an exceptional case, with no bearing upon the general question of the hierarchy of the religious orders. Article 3 of Question 188 poses the question whether a religious order can be directed to soldiering. Thomas lists 4 objections, the first of which is the most fundamental. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount commands the turning of the cheek and forbids resisting the striker. Therefore, Thomas's objector insists, no one aspiring to Christian perfection can obey that command while at the same time being a soldier, because non-retaliation is inconsistent with the duties of a soldier. To this objection, Thomas replies by distinguishing 2 ways of non-resistance to evil, either by patiently enduring a wrong done to oneself, a patience pertinent to perfection if it serves the spiritual welfare of others, or by tolerating patiently a wrong done to another. The latter, according to Thomas, pertains to imperfection, or even to vice, to the coward's lack of courage and charity. Thomas quotes St. Ambrose's prayer in De Officiis of the courageous just man who in battle defends his country against barbarians or protects the weak at home or friends against robbers. The following 3 objections to military religious orders are treated as relatively weak and shortly answered. To the objection that religious are forbidden in the decretals to plead at law at a court case, and therefore a fortiori they cannot engage in physical combat. I love the comparison of soldiers to lawyers. Thomas argues that while the decretals do prohibit the professional practice of law by religious for worldly gain, they explicitly allow for religious to serve as counsels in the law if they do so at the order of their religious superior in the legal defense of the monastery. To the objection that religious persons embrace a penitential life and that militant penitents are regularly forbidden to return to a life of worldly soldiering, Thomas answers that in the context of the Crusades, soldiering is sometimes actually imposed as a penance, as is the case of those upon whom it is enjoined to take arms in defense of the Holy Land. Imagine getting that as a penance. Finally, to the objection that just wars are fought at the command of the emperor, Thomas replies that the religious members of military orders wage war not on their own authority, but on the authority of the sovereign or the church. Interestingly, Thomas in the following article uses the same argument to answer an objection concerning the authority establishing the mendicant orders as orders for preaching. Drawing an explicit comparison to orders established for soldiering, Thomas explains, quote, certain religious orders are established for preaching and hearing confessions, not indeed by their own authority, but by the authority of the higher and lower superiors to whom these things belong by virtue of their office. Thomas's general response to the question of the military orders as legitimate forms of religious life is to say that the military orders may be numbered among the religious orders founded to accomplish charitable works in the world, active works of mercy in the service of our fellow human beings out of love for God. Quote, the occupation of soldiering may be directed to the assistance of our neighbor, not only as regards private individuals, but also as regards the defense of the whole commonwealth, unquote. Thomas cites Augustine's praise of David, the biblical witness of the Maccabees who defended Israel and Israel's institutions for divine worship, and the exhortation found in Psalm 81:4, rescue the poor and deliver the needy out of the hand of the sinner. The placement of Article 3 concerning the military orders right before Article 4 concerning the orders established for preaching and hearing confessions is telling. Thomas implicitly and explicitly likens the mendicants to the military religious by virtue of their active engagement in the world, their ecclesiastical authorization, and their courageous defense of the church. Proceeding step by step, Thomas in Article 6 finally elevates the preachers over the soldiers by emphasizing the strong contemplative component in the mixed life of the preachers and minimizing that same component in the active life of the soldiers. The question of the soldiers' martyrdom will, however, finally trouble that hierarchy, as we shall see. Article 5, concerning whether a religious order should be established for the purpose of study, accomplishes several purposes. It elusively associates the old monastic orders with the pursuit of the contemplative life for its own sake, thus widening the theoretical gap between them and all the active orders, including the military orders. It contrasts the sort of study in which monks are engaged to the study in which preachers engage themselves, and it acknowledges the moral value of biblical knowledge for all who strive for Christian perfection according to the evangelical counsels. Finally, in Article 6, Thomas addresses the question to which the whole series of questions has actually been aimed: whether a religious order that is devoted to the contemplative life is more excellent than one given to the active life. The first objector argues against the superiority of the contemplative orders on the grounds that the active orders serve the common profit, and teaching is to be preferred to silence. The second objector argues for the superiority of the military orders, whose fight against evil is a witness given unto blood, quoting Hebrews 12:4, and thus expresses perfect charity. The third objector invokes the criterion of ascetical strictness, against which many monasteries fall short. Against the objectors, Thomas acknowledges the contemplative life to be the highest, due to its end in the highest good. But he goes on to say that an active life that proceeds from the fullness of contemplation into teaching or preaching is more excellent than simple contemplation, because it is better to give to others the fruits of one's contemplation than merely to contemplate. Such a mixed life of contemplation and action is closest to that of the episcopate, and thus stands at the top of the triad, followed by the pure contemplatives, and in the third place, the active orders caring for bodily needs. Thomas's reply to the objection that associates martyrdom with the military orders is interesting. Referring again to the criterion of the final cause, the end, or main purpose of the order, Thomas explains that the military orders aim, quote, more directly at shedding the enemy's blood than at the shedding of their own, unquote. He admits, however, that a religious knight may well, quote, acquire the merit of martyrdom, and in this respect stands higher than the other religious, even as in some cases the works of the active life take precedence over contemplation, unquote. Again, Thomas does not cite Bernard of Clairvaux, but the Cistercian abbot's mysticism of the new knighthood must have moved Thomas to include this exception to his own rule. In On Loving God, Bernard famously describes 4 degrees of love, the fourth of which extends beyond the benevolent love that loves God for God's own sake, and not for any earthly reward, to an ecstatic love, by which one loves one's very self only for God's sake. Bernard finds the attainment of such a love rare and hardly attainable in this life. But all the same, he wonders, quote, do we not think the martyrs received this grace, at least partially, while they were still in their victorious bodies, unquote? Similarly, in Praise of the New Knighthood, Bernard exclaims, "How blessedly martyrs die in battle! If they are blessed who die in the Lord, how much more so those who die for the Lord." And with this sentiment, St. Thomas evidently agrees.
Okay. Well, first, I'm sorry that I didn't present you after asking you to send the data and all the stuff. Sorry. Sorry. Thank you. Don't give me as penance to go to Jerusalem and fight for the Holy Land. Well, so we open a time for questions.
Hello, sister.
Hello, Will.
I had a question about the limits of St. Thomas's views on the martyrdom of the religious orders. Because it seems it would be a bit of a strain, at least on our present understanding of martyrdom, to see any death in battle by a member of one of these orders as a formal martyrdom. A knight protecting someone from being robbed is not being killed because he is Christian. He's being killed because of the malice of the robber. So does St. Thomas address this issue? If not, what do you think he means by emphasizing the possibility of martyrdom for the knights?
Okay, so the question of martyrdom for the faith, right? That was the usual definition of martyrdom, even in this period. But it's interesting to see that the definition of martyrdom is extended in our own time, right, to martyrs of charity, right? People who were killed, for instance, in South America because of their defense of, their living the social gospel, right? So, they're caring for the needs of the poor. They're advocating for land rights. And this has now been acknowledged, right, as a form of martyrdom. It's the Christian life to which they are bearing witness, the gospel incarnate, right, as their life, as they live the Sermon on the Mount. And so it's interesting to think that maybe St. Thomas already was anticipating, that kind of an expanded definition of martyrdom. The other thing that might not be known to you in this room is that the idea of self-defense, right, of killing in self-defense, was not something that was generally accepted. So you could kill. I mean, if you saw somebody was going to kill someone else, right? But if it's a threat only to your own life, the general teaching was that it would be better to die than to kill, right? And why would they want to kill you, right? It would be because you had you'd put yourself on the line to defend Christian pilgrims, or the right of Christians to go to the holy places. And so we could say, but what does it mean to die for the faith, right? It was a very sort of practical way of expressing the faith, of committing to the faith. And all of this was sort of very, very new, right? Very new. I mean, the theology of the Crusades put the sacrifices of the military in this intention at the same level as almsgiving, right? It's in the other ways, that you could atone for sin, right? And they also had some idea about kind of a rehabilitation of people who had a violent past, right? That somehow giving them a good cause to fight for, might be rehabilitating. So anyway, but that's just a side note. But I think that that's the case, so that you're making yourself vulnerable, and you're not there for self-defense. But even St. Bernard, when you think about it, in the heat of battle, right, to have that kind of clear intention that is absolutely selfless, and where your passions are, at peace, right? It's almost impossible, right? It's quite a feat, right? And then St. Bernard says, if you kill the enemy out of hatred, out of revenge, out of wrath, at that moment that your sword pierces the enemy, you kill your own soul, right? So.
And I appreciated that very much. But something's bothering me, and it's nothing to do with your scholarship or the way you presented this, but isn't there something incongruous about the idea of religious who are devoted to warfare?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if my memory serves, and it doesn't always, Aquinas, in the question on warfare itself, talks about whether clerics can go to war.
Right.
And he says going to war is legitimate, but this is not suitable to clerics.
Yeah. And the answer to that would be that they're not clerics.
Well,
right?
no, I get that. I understand that.
Okay.
But even if they're not clerics, for similar reasons, isn't there some? I mean, this is what I feel. I know it's not what Aquinas says. But isn't there something incongruous about the whole idea of religious who are living a religious life, attempting to attain a state of perfection, engaged in violent acts as a systematic part of their religious vocation? I mean, to me, that just seems deeply, deeply problematic. And I just want to put it, I guess more than anything else, I just want to put it on the table, but I'm wondering what you think.
Thank you for that. And I think, if you take the long view, all these, the orders that were founded as military orders are now purely charitable organizations, if they still exist. I know the Templars went out of existence. Like the Hospitalers, I don't know if they exist anymore, but the Knights of the Sepulchre, I mean, they're not military orders, right? They're charitable organizations. And then there's also the curious thing that monks, with their vow of stabilitas loci, they're not going to be going either on, they're not supposed to be going on pilgrimage or crusades, right? Their place is bound to the land, and monks are not always clerics either, right? So that it kind of makes the point, right, that their vocation is to the spiritual defense and not to physical warfare. So this is really on the frontiers of medieval theology, to even contemplate the possibility, and I think the one plus that I've been able to come up with, to my own mind, is that the church sort of through this sort of put on offer a possibility for the laity, right, to aspire to Christian perfection, and in that way, put the military orders kind of on a par with the older orders that existed, and so it was carved out a kind of a different path, for the laity, a path that was honored, right. But it seems to have been an experiment that pretty much failed. So.
Okay, thank you. Now we proceed with Professor. So it's Professor Daniel Philpott. He's professor of political science at the University of Notre. He earned his PhD in 1996 from Harvard University and specializes in religion and global politics, focusing on religious freedom, reconciliation, the political behavior of religious actors, and Christian political theology. And his monographs include, he has several, but includes Revolution in Sovereignty, published by Princeton, and God's Century, Resurgent Religion and Global Politics, published by Notre in 2011. And he's going to talk now about justifying justice, a Thomist argument.
Okay, thank you very much. Such an honor to speak at this tremendous conference. I've been so appreciative of it. And so thank you. A great deal is at stake in what we mean by justice. Philosopher John Rawls's apophthegm, "Justice is the first virtue of social institutions," can find the endorsement of history's greatest political philosophers, including Plato, Aristotle, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and yes, Thomas Aquinas. For many centuries now, the dominant concept of justice has been that which is formulated, the constant will to render another his due. Rendering due, I argue, is synonymous with giving people their rights, that to which they are entitled. This notion of justice has its roots in Roman law and has dominated Western political philosophy, as well as the constitutions of today's nation-states. Christians may ask, though, is this concept of justice the same as the one that God has revealed and implanted in the reason of human beings? I contend that the justice to which Christianity testifies, expressed most fully in the Bible, differs markedly, though not completely, from the justice of rendering due. If modern ears find reckless the claim that justice means something other than due, Christians ought to reflect that the due concept comes from Greek and Roman thought, not through the biblical tradition. This justice, I argue, carries an overarching meaning of comprehensive right relationship, meaning the entirety of right conduct on the part of God and of humans. This justice affirms obligations that correspond to rights, the meaning of that which is due, but also obligations that extend beyond what is due, such as mercy, generosity, friendship, hospitality, forgiveness, and living one's life as a gift. These are affirmed in the Bible, ultimately taught by Jesus. It is a justice that we may know through a combination of reason and revelation. Jesus' very cross and resurrection, God's salvific acts, which reconfigure the universe, the Scripture describes as acts of justice. This justice also combines the fulfillment of what is due and actions that extend beyond due. What does all this have to do with the birthday boy, Thomas Aquinas? Aquinas is central in Catholic thought about justice and the political order, and plays an important role in the book I am writing on the meaning of justice. So where is he situated in the argument? At first, it might seem that I am challenging the angelic doctor head on. After all, he enshrines the rendering due definition of justice in the Summa Theologica, Secunda Secunda, Article 58. It is an influential enshrining, has shaped Catholic thought and much modern political philosophy, arguably, to this day. The Catechism adopts this definition of justice. I will argue, however, that Aquinas' thought and the justice of right relationship converge much more than they might seem to at first. In the presentation that remains, I propose first to outline the justice of right relationship, the justice to which the Bible testifies. Second, to look at how this justice is related to the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Where is justice to be found in the Bible? It is a matter of translation. Justice is, after all, an English word, not a word in the Bible's original languages. The case for justice in the Bible depends on a twofold task of translation. First, we must fix the meaning of Hebrew and Greek words in the Bible that pose as candidates for justice. Second, we must establish that the English word justice properly translates them. To take the first task, among the most important words that could translate into justice are, first, the Hebrew tzedek, or its feminine variant, tzedakah, which appears 276 times in the Old Testament and means comprehensive right relationship. In the Septuagint, the 2nd century BCE translation of the Bible into Greek, tzedek is translated by dikaiosune, a word that then appears in the New Testament 92 times, in fact, where it also means comprehensive right relationship. English readers of the Bible might be surprised that these words translate into justice. In many Bibles, justice is not Justice does not appear nearly as frequently as these words do in the original Hebrew and Greek scriptures. The reason for this is that justice often hides behind righteousness, the word to which translators often instead turn to translate tzedek into dikaiosune. A tradition exists, however, of translating as justice the words that translators often render as righteousness. This is the tradition of Latin, the language that contains the root for the English word justice, but none for the English word righteousness, whose root is Germanic. In the Vulgate, the historically influential Latin translation of the Bible, all of the words, or almost all of the words, that sometimes appear in English Bibles as righteousness appear instead as justitia, or a close variant. Almost all instances of tzedek and dikaiosune are translated as justitia, or a cognate version of the term. While there is perhaps no definitive case as to whether these terms ought to be translated into English through justice or righteousness, translating them as justice is warranted, I argue. English contains usages of justice that approximate comprehensive right relationship, as found, for instance, in the writings of Care Feminist, the restorative justice movement, and translations of Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Ethics, where justice sometimes was meant comprehensively. By choosing justice to translate these terms in the Bible, we gain a biblical vision of that virtue which is widely thought to be the primary one of public life. Here, my primary focus is on tzedek and dikaiosune, which carry the comprehensive meaning in which I am most interested. While maintaining their general meaning, these terms as found in the scriptures vary along two dimensions. The first pertains to agency. Sometimes it is God who exercises justice, and sometimes it is humans who are commanded to exercise justice. The second follows a distinction that philosopher Nicholas Walterstorff has introduced, that between primary justice, defining what it means to live in right relationship, and rectifying justice, defining what it means to address past wrongs. Together, the two distinctions create four dimensions of the justice of right relationship, corresponding to actual uses of tzedek, which are arrayed in the table here. Understanding biblical justice begins with divine agency, the top row of the diagram, reflecting that it is God who both establishes and restores justice. Divine primary justice is depicted most vividly in the Psalms and Isaiah. God, acting out of his just character, establishes moral order, proclaims commandments that govern human beings' relationship to one another and to God, creates human beings so that they flourish through these commandments, and attaches blessings and curses for following or failing to follow these commandments. Divine rectifying justice is God's restoration of comprehensive right relationship in response to the sin of humanity. In 2nd Isaiah, tzedek means the saving justice through which God restores the Israelites after their exile in Babylon. In the letter to the Romans, influenced by Isaiah, Paul employs the justice of God to describe God's salvation of the world through Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. 2 Peter uses justice to describe the new heavens and new earth where this restoration of right relationship has been completed. Human primary justice, that of the lower left-hand quadrant, is the comprehensive right relationship that God commands humans to enact. In the Old Testament, tzedek often means the entirety of the laws that God revealed in his covenants, most importantly, the laws he gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. In the New Testament, dikaiosune means Jesus' entire teachings about how to live, most importantly, the new law that he proffered on the Sermon on the Mount. Human rectifying justice, that of the lower right-hand quadrant, involves God's teaching about how humans are to respond to wrongs, namely sins and crimes. In the Old Testament, this includes commandments and precepts on responding to wrongs in the community of Israel. In the New Testament, it includes the teachings of Jesus on retaliation and forgiveness, as well as those of Paul on the same issues, as well as the proper functions of temporal authority, including punishment. We may now contrast biblical justice and the justice of rendering due. My broad claim is that biblical justice does not void what is due, but rather enfolds and exceeds it in a wider notion of justice. Consider divine rectifying justice, the justice of God's response to sin. In part, the Bible describes this response in terms and metaphors that comport with due. In Isaiah, God's justice involves the punishment of Israel through exile, but also redemption, ransom, recompense, expiation, and the demand of service from Israel, all terms that involve due. In the New Testament, numerous metaphors for Christ's saving action connote the rendering of due, acquittal, paying the debt of sin, expiation, and ransom. Yet, 2nd Isaiah also describes Israel as being renewed, restored to its land, and restored to right relationship within the community, especially through the uplifting of the poor. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, tells of God's saving activity as a gracious gift that God bestowed while we were still sinners, meaning that God did not give humanity its due. In God's strange justice, God graciously renders what is due on behalf of those who owe what is due but cannot pay it. Like the author of Isaiah, Paul insists that this saving justice actually restores persons and relationships, bestowing life, grace, peace, charity, and the presence of the Spirit. Human justice, both primary and rectifying, also involves both rendering what is due and giving what is beyond due. It involves rights, which the Bible affirms in many places, though usually in highly particular ways, which I argue can be apprehended through natural law. The principle of retribution in human affairs, especially in context of judgment, finds a place in both the Old and New Testaments. The Bible's human primary justice, expressed through tzedek and dikaiosune, though, also involves commandments and virtues that extend beyond due, such as generosity, mercy, a wide obligation of service to the poor and the stranger, and living one's life as a gift. I argue that many of them take the form of what Kant called wide duties, where it's not specified exactly how they are to be discharged, towards whom they are to be discharged, and so forth. Human rectifying justice involves the forgiveness of moral debts, love for enemies, and reconciliation, or a restoration of right relationship, all of which involves either foregoing due or giving to others in excess of what they are owed, have a right to, or had coming to them. Human justice, broadly speaking, flows from divine justice. Biblical justice culminates in the cross and resurrection of Jesus, which brings to a climax God's saving justice, vindicates and gives new authority to the justice that God calls humans to perform, and sets forth the decisive pattern of human justice, namely self-giving love in conformity and imitation of Jesus' sacrifice. Take up your cross and follow me, as all of the synoptic gospels proclaim. Human justice flows from divine justice. Embodying this justice is the sacrament of the Eucharist, which enacts God's saving justice and transforms its human participants such that they become this justice. The justice of right relationship, then, is Eucharistic justice. In the book, I will say much more about this justice, for instance, how it relates to other important concepts such as mercy and peace. I want now to turn to Thomas Aquinas. Again, it may seem that my claim about justice in the Bible flies in the face of Aquinas, who gives central place to the justice of rendering due. But in fact, there is much greater convergence. First, the justice of right relationship that I defend does not reject what is due or its synonym, rights. It enfolds obligations that correspond to rights, but also include obligations that exceed rights. One of my arguments is that Aquinas' definition of justice in the Secunda Secunda, question 58, does include rights. This is a claim that not all Thomist scholars agree with, and it takes some interpretation. I would argue it's implicit, but yet there. I hold, though, that rights are implied by the use of the words due, his, and debitum. They imply that certain obligations are owed to their recipient, and they are entitled to them, the definition of rights. The popular Blackfriars translation of the Summa actually uses the words right and rights to depict what is due. Another support for rights in Aquinas is references throughout his writings to particular rights, which he denotes through use. There are over 23 of these usages. For instance, there is the right of parents to raise their children in their faith, and many others. That there are rights in Aquinas is endorsed by scholars ranging among John Finnis, I read Jean this way, Thomas Williams, and Father Dominic Legge in his recent article, Do Thomists Have Rights? Scholars who disagree on many other issues. With Aquinas, then, I affirm natural rights, ones that are embedded in natural law, and incorporate them into my definition of justice. Now, it would seem that I depart from Aquinas in arguing that justice enfolds obligations that also enfolds obligations that extend beyond rights. But things are not so simple. Only a few questions later, in the Secunda Secunda, Aquinas discusses what he calls the potential parts of justice, which are virtues involving actions towards others, but ones that do not fully fit his definition of justice. For instance, they may not be due to others. He gives the examples of liberality, affability, and friendship. Or they may not involve equality, which he also argues is essential to justice in question 58. He gives the examples of obligations to one's parents and to God. Now, in contrast to Aquinas, I would argue the Bible treats all human obligations towards others and towards God as justice. Yet, Aquinas' category of potential parts reveals that he recognizes that there are actions towards others that omit due as well as equality, and that they are related to justice. In other places in his writings, Aquinas makes reference to justice that combines due and what is more than what is due. In several places in the Summa, Aquinas refers to God's justification of humanity through the cross and resurrection as justice. He makes clear that God's justice involves paying our debt as well as actions that go beyond debt in the tertia par. In his commentaries on books of the Bible, Aquinas follows the Vulgate in using justitia to refer to the saving action of God, which is a gift, a matter of gratuity, even while it also vicariously pays our debt. He follows the Vulgate, for instance, in translating as justitia Paul's description of God's saving action in the 3rd chapter of his letter to the Romans. I argue then that justice in the Bible means comprehensive right relationship, and that this justice enfolds obligations that render due or fulfill rights, as well as ones that exceed rights. This conception is closer to Aquinas' treatment than it may at first seem. It enfolds due or rights. It affirms that Aquinas himself recognizes dimensions of justice, or at least potential, that exceed what is due. Aquinas also views justice as God's justification through the cross and resurrection, and affirms that it is a matter of rendering due and exceeding due. In the book, I seek to apply the justice of right relationship to the contemporary state and to today's politics, including matters such as the human right to life, racial justice, judicial punishment, and many others. I seek to show what politics could look like were it to involve both what is due and what is more than due. Here, too, I find invaluable assistance in the work of Thomas Aquinas. Thank you. Yes. Go ahead, Jan.
You too? I wanted to ask something in the common question session. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. That was very enlightening, especially to me, about the biblical notion of justice as comprehensive right relationship. And let me explain my, quandary. I don't think it's really a quandary. It seems as though that, and it's in relation to mercy, and I know you're going to actually pursue that in the book. So in the biblical notion of justice as comprehensive right relationship, it seems to make easier the understanding that there's really no difference between God's mercy in Scripture and God's justice, right? Because mercy would be part of a comprehensive right relationship, though you might, in terms of subsequent understandings, wonder to what extent mercy is due and stuff like that. But biblically, it seems like that makes it actually pretty straightforward. It's just part of the comprehensive right relationship, and so there may be no difference on the part of the effect. But then when I think about Thomas, I mean, one of the issues he has to deal with in the discussion of divine mercy is whether or not justice and mercy are found in all of God's acts. And whatever he says about that, one of the things he says along the way is that, in fact, on the part of the effect, because of divine simplicity, they're the same thing on the part of the agent, but in terms of the effect, he says some pretty strong things there about misericordia actually being something that goes beyond justice. It's not that it actually reigns justice in, it actually goes further than justice. And also that justice strives after misericordia as its end. And that's the kind of thing that in Thomas might make one suspect that the notion of justice is actually maybe not one of a comprehensive right relationship. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's good. One thing I want to say about my project of thinking about justice is that I don't pursue it in the book as a Thomist project strictly, and I don't present it as something that would, meet the standards of the right interpretation of Thomas or meeting the standards of Thomas. Nevertheless, I draw on Thomas a great deal as a kind of, somebody who, is very, very helpful for understanding these things. So one of the things that I've come to think about justice in the Bible is that it is a very broad and sweeping concept, and sweeping and encompassing, and I think that Gene, you call it architectonic, and I think it's architectonic and includes many other things, and I think that other virtues, although they're not equivalent to justice or mean the same thing, are kind of enfolded under justice's umbrella. So I see mercy, and I think this is similar to Thomas. Also followed John Paul II in his Divus in Misericordia. I see mercy as the broad will to restore whatever's broken. So it implies that there's something broken, injured, wounded, distressed. And mercy is the will to restore something that is somehow broken. And so mercy falls into, mercy is not all of justice, not all of these will to, a right relationship, but it is some things. So it's a subset. And now mercy, I also see it as broad. It's referring to, restoring those things that are broken by sin as well as by misfortune, the earthquake or the criminal, right? And so it could be either of those things. So it can fall into both what I call primary justice and rectifying justice. Rectifying justice is justice oriented towards a wrong. So I guess I see mercy as part of this umbrella of justice, but not equivalent to, not the same thing as justice. It still has a distinct meaning, which does work. So that's broadly how I would fit it.
Thanks, Dan. So I wanted to ask about, like in Aristotle, he draws a distinction between general justice and particular justice, and he says
Yeah.
general justice is really just the whole of virtue. And I wondered if your concept of this comprehensive right relationship that seems to be kind of marking out slightly different territory. But I wondered if it's kind of related to that broader notion of justice. And when Aquinas talks about these potential parts of justice,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is he taking justice in that spot as this kind of just parts of virtue in general?
Yeah, I think that's the biblical notion of justice as right, comprehensive right relationship shares in the generality of justice that you find in, say, Aristotle. And so Aquinas adopts the concept of general justice, right? I mean, one thing to think about, though, is the relationship between that and the will to render another his due. So in my argument, the concept of general justice or sweeping justice would include obligations that render others their due, as well as things that go beyond what is due. And now I think Aquinas takes some strides towards that in the sense of he's got the due conception, but then, in potential parts and other aspects, I think makes some motions towards towards that general justice might include, also what is beyond due. One other thing that I find about the biblical notion of justice, where I'd have maybe some disagreement with Thomas, is that, or that I think the biblical notion has some disagreement, is that I think that biblical injustice, the right relationship happens along three dimensions: a person's human-God relations, human-human relations, but also relations within the parts of the soul. Those three dimensions. And so Aquinas, in several places, he seems to say that justice is about external behavior, right? So I pay my bills, but not so concerned about what's in the heart of the bill payer, right? But he does look at, so Plato does think that justice has to do with the parts of the soul. Now Aquinas uses the term metaphorical justice, and when he refers to Plato's justice as part of the soul, parts of the soul. And again, I think there's a sense in Aquinas of wanting to recognize that others think of that as justice, but I'm calling it something not fully justice, right? Kind of like with the potential parts.
I think we leave your question for the general one. Okay. So we go to the third presentation.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
A second. Sorry. Are you going to? Okay, Stuart Clem. That's it. Stuart Clem is the next expositor. He's also associate professor of moral theology and Sister Maureen McGuire, chair of health care mission at Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis, Missouri. He earned his PhD in theology at the University of Notre Dame and an MDiv at Duke University School. And his interests include Thomistic moral theology, virtue ethics, the natural law tradition, and the intersection of religion and morality. He is the author of Lying and Truthfulness, a Thomistic Perspective, published by Cambridge. And he is currently writing a book on biblical law and Christian ethics. And he's going to talk about reasonable commandments, the Decalogue as natural law in Aquinas.
Thanks. Well, first of all, thanks for sticking around for the very last paper of the last session of the last day of the conference. If you're still here, it means you either just have pity on me or you really love Thomas Aquinas, or both, I suppose. But nonetheless, I appreciate you being here. The handout's going around. Just wanted to say a little bit about the origins of this project. I really began thinking about it more than a decade ago in a doctoral seminar with Gene Porter, who's here with us, on the Decalogue as natural law. And there was a question that was sort of tangential to the presentation that I gave then, but it kept nagging me, and it started nagging me even more as I began teaching this material to graduate students. And if you'll just take, I know you've all seen the Decalogue before, I don't think it's new to anybody, but if you'll look on the back side of the handout, it will be helpful just to have it in front of you, and also, I'm sure as many of you are aware, different Christian traditions number the precepts of the Decalogue differently, so it would be important to have this version in front of us. But just kind of, as you're glancing at the first and what are traditionally considered the first and second tables of the Decalogue, you can immediately see a kind of asymmetry here if we want to give some account of how these commandments could be considered natural law, right? And so my students would really press me on this, and as I was trying to explain Aquinas' view, because it's just, even for someone who is really taken with the broad concept of natural law, you can see how these commandments on this first table are far from intuitive. And so that drove me back to the primary text to really get some answers, and I found that Aquinas really clearly spells it out, in my judgment. But then when I went to survey the secondary literature to find people who were noticing the same things I was, not only was there really a dearth of literature on this, but the few people who were commenting on it were giving very different explanations from what I found myself reading. So that's kind of the starting point for this paper. So without further ado, Thomas Aquinas is one of the foremost natural law thinkers in human history, and virtually all of Aquinas' interpreters have recognized that he considers the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, as recorded in the book of Exodus, to be an expression of natural law. But what this means precisely is a matter of dispute. In fact, what I wish to argue in this paper is that it should be a matter of greater dispute than it has been among his interpreters. I say this because the standard interpretations of Aquinas on the Decalogue only acknowledge that tenets of the natural law are contained in the Decalogue, or they merely pay lip service to Aquinas' claim that the precepts of the Decalogue belong to the natural law. And here, I apologize that the paper was not last minute, but the handout was, and I kind of just threw some things on there, so I apologize if there aren't any kind of detailed textual references. So I'll be giving those as I go. I'm also happy to send anyone the text of the paper that has all of this and more in the footnotes. My email address is just clem@ai.edu. It'll be focusing primarily on the Prima Secundae question 100, but I'll try to give the textual references as I go along. Okay, so for example, what I was just describing, in his otherwise illuminating commentary on Aquinas' treatise on law in the Summa, R.J. Henley ends his analysis just before the questions on the old law, and then informs the reader that these texts are only of interest to those with religious or theological interests. He says this, I found it remarkable. He says, if one wishes to develop a Thomistic philosophy of natural law, or of anything else, he must extricate the philosophical principles from the theological doctrine with which they are intertwined. So that's his take on it. Randall Smith, who is not, I don't think, in this room, but he's at this conference, has written extensively on Aquinas and the Decalogue. Much of it I find very helpful. But in one essay, he suggests but does not develop the idea that there is a fundamental asymmetry in the two tables of the Decalogue. So the first table contains precepts regarding one's duties to God. The second table contains precepts regarding one's duties toward other human beings. So despite his affirmation that for Aquinas both tables reflect the natural law, Smith suggests that Aquinas thinks that only the precepts of the second table can be known through natural reason, without the aid of divine revelation. Many other commentators read Aquinas along similar lines as Henley and Smith, and I'm not trying to conflate their views, but they do have something in common. And so I'll be referring to this view as the standard interpretation of Aquinas on the Decalogue. So in a nutshell, the standard interpretation is simply that the second table reflects the natural law in a straightforward way, whereas the first table does not. Before turning to my critique of the standard interpretation and offering my own alternative, I want to identify two key points found in Aquinas' writing on the Decalogue, as well as two key concepts that he deploys throughout these texts. So the first point is that all the moral precepts found in the Old Law, and the Old Law for Aquinas is basically coterminous with the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, all the moral precepts are reducible to the 10 precepts of the Decalogue. He says this in question 100, Article 3. The second point is that the Decalogue is a further specification of what Aquinas calls the first principles of natural law. These two principles can be formulated in different ways, but they essentially amount to love of God and love of neighbor. These principles, he says, are most certain and so evident as to need no promulgation. That's why they're first principles. The precepts of the Decalogue, however, are not the first principles, but they can be discerned after what he calls only slight consideration, in Latin, modica consideratione, slight consideration of these principles. He says that also in question 100, Article 3. So the first concept I want to identify here is the concept or term per se nota. This Latin term is often translated into English as self-evident, but it's more accurately rendered as something like known in itself, or in less idiomatic English, that which cannot be coherently denied. It just rolls right off the tongue, but you've got to try to capture it somehow in English. So to highlight the special role that this term plays in Aquinas' thought, I'm going to leave it untranslated. What's important for now is to note that Aquinas thinks that the first principles of natural law are per se nota. In other words, the precepts, love of God and love of neighbor, are so basic that they do not even need to be promulgated. They are so fundamental to what it means to be human that they cannot be coherently denied. Now, the second concept I want to highlight is what Aquinas refers to as the three grades, or the tres gradus, of the natural law. And these are on the handout there. So the first is what includes the first principles of natural law. The second grade is the further specifications of the first principles, which are moral precepts identical with the precepts of the Decalogue. And then the third include determinations of the moral precepts that require more subtle reflection. So this time it's subtiliori consideratione, so more subtle reflection on the first principles. Here I'm drawing from Articles 1 and 11 of question 100. Thus, the precepts of the Decalogue are considered second-grade precepts of the natural law. But as Aquinas goes on to explain, there is a sense in which the first and third-grade precepts are contained in the Decalogue. And I have a very simple illustration on the handout to say it. Basically, the idea is that depending on how you're looking at it, the precepts of the Decalogue can be considered conclusions of more basic principles, or they can function as principles that lead to more specific conclusions. Now, this may strike some people as a needless complication, but what he's striving to show us is the way in which the Decalogue is the perfect instantiation of the precepts of the natural law. The standard interpretation of Aquinas on the Decalogue, however, takes as its starting point the assumption that the first principle, love of God, cannot be per se nota through natural reason. The standard interpretation, I'll have to say, has the benefit of aligning with many people's sensibilities today regarding the religious character of the first table of the Decalogue. It also, ostensibly, allows us to make sense of some of the difficult passages in Aquinas' treatise on the Old Law. But I believe that the standard interpretation is wrong. I'll say more about why I think it's wrong momentarily. But first, I will note that if I'm correct in this assessment, then it leaves us with two options. One option would be simply to concede that Aquinas' understanding of the relationship between the Decalogue and the natural law is incoherent, or our other option is to propose an alternative interpretation. I don't think it will surprise anyone to know that I'm going with the second option. So I'm going to propose an alternative reading of Aquinas on the Decalogue. Now, I don't have the time here to defend the philosophical or theological merits of what I think his position is. I'm simply trying to give a correct reading. I'm not going to have time to ponder all of its implications. Perhaps we'll be able to do a bit of that in the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to do my best to defend it as a coherent account and as a plausible reading of Aquinas' texts. So first, a brief summary of what the standard interpretation gets wrong. The greatest difficulty for this view, I think, is that it cannot reconcile, on the one hand, the claim that the precepts of the first table of the Decalogue require divine instruction. That's the claim, at least. They require divine instruction in order to be known. To reconcile that with Aquinas' claim that all the precepts of the Decalogue are second-grade precepts. Recall that second-grade precepts, according to Aquinas, only require slight consideration of the first principles of the natural law. But precepts that require divine instruction cannot be second-grade precepts. Precepts that require divine instruction are further determinations of the natural law, such as those found in the ceremonial and judicial laws of the Old Testament. He says this in question 99, Article 4. So the standard interpretation is irreconcilable with Aquinas' 3 grades of moral precepts. The problems with the standard interpretation are compounded when we consider its bifurcation of principles that are known per se nota. While it's true that Aquinas states that the first principles of natural law are known per se nota to human reason through nature or through faith, there is no evidence to suggest that these modes are mutually exclusive. In other words, Aquinas does not say that one of these principles can only be known through faith. Rather, it's plausible, and on my reading I think it's correct, to interpret both principles as being known either through reason or through faith. But the standard interpretation assumes that the principle of love of God is per se nota only through faith. And this has the effect of creating a radical asymmetry between the 2 tables of the Decalogue. It undermines Aquinas' claim that all the precepts of the Decalogue are second-grade precepts, knowable to us through slight reflection on the first principles of natural law. Instead, it proposes that the second table of the Decalogue expresses the natural law in the traditional sense, whereas the first table reflects the natural law only in a vague or remote sense, a determination of the natural law that requires divine assistance in order to be known at all. Perhaps something like this understanding of the Decalogue might be defended on other grounds, but it cannot be Aquinas' view. So now I'll sketch what I think is a more plausible and faithful reading of Aquinas. First, I'll make a preliminary observation about the possibility of interpreting the first and second tables as expressions of the natural law in a straightforward, unequivocal sense. While there are some obvious difficulties that need to be addressed, and I'll do that shortly, first I want to say something about the connection between law and virtue in Aquinas' thought. Aquinas elucidates this connection in many places, but perhaps most explicitly in the Prima Secundae, question 100, Article 2, where he explains that the precepts of the Decalogue direct a person toward acts of virtue. While the virtue of justice is the moral virtue that directs our actions towards our neighbors, we might wonder which virtue or virtues are being directed by the precepts of the Decalogue that pertain to God. Well, the answer cannot be the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, at least not if we are trying to understand the Decalogue as an expression of natural law, because those virtues are infused by God and direct us toward an end that cannot be known through natural reason. So that's not going to work. So what is it? Well, the relevant virtue in this case is religio. In contrast to our contemporary usage of the term religion to refer to a particular system of faith and worship, for the medieval scholastics, religion, or religio, refers to the way in which one properly relates to his or her creator. If you were at the Hillbilly Thomist concert last night, we got to hear a little song about religion. The first time I've ever heard the principal parts of justice being sung over a banjo. It was quite remarkable. But for Aquinas and other medieval theologians, religion is also a moral virtue. Now, of the 4 cardinal virtues, it most closely relates to the virtue of justice, which is a habit whereby a person renders to each one his or her due by a constant and perpetual will. Since the relationship between God and humankind is intrinsically asymmetrical, it is impossible for humans to render God what is due, and thus the virtue of religion does not formally meet the criteria of the definition of justice. It is one of the several virtues Aquinas describes as being annexed to justice. Now, the fact that this virtue is annexed to one of the cardinal virtues does not imply that it is of lesser importance. In fact, Aquinas states that religio is the chief of the moral virtues. He says this in the Secunda Secundae, question 81, Article 6. He says that religio is chief or praecipua of the moral virtues. So by recognizing religio as a virtue, Aquinas believes that humans owe something to God simply by virtue of their existence as creatures who are dependent on God for their very being. This claim does not depend on any unique tenets of the Christian faith or of any other belief system that we would today call a religion. Rather, Aquinas understands the basic obligation of all human beings to offer service and worship to God as something that is discernible through the natural law. This does not mean that the natural law dictates the precise mode of religious observance. Aquinas writes, "It belongs to the dictates of natural reason that people should do something through reverence for God. But that they should do this or that determinate thing does not belong to the dictate of natural reason, but is established by divine or human law." So when we consider the Decalogue as an expression of the natural law, we can see that the commandments in the first table relate to the virtue of religio. As Aquinas explains, human beings, qua human beings, owe God, who is the head of the human community, our fidelity, reverence, and service, and religio is the virtue directed toward such acts. In his treatise on justice and the Secunda Secundae, he explicitly connects this virtue with the first table of the Decalogue. He says the first 3 precepts are about acts of religio, which is the chief part of justice. So he explicitly makes this connection in his text. That's in Secunda Secundae, question 122, article 1. Much more could be said along these lines, but I trust that these observations illuminate the first 3 commandments of the Decalogue as expressions of natural law, without appealing to some special knowledge that requires the theological virtue of faith. Yet, even if this is plausible, I acknowledge there remain some interpretive difficulties. So I'm going to address the problems that arise when we consider the precise wording of the commandments in the first table of the Decalogue in contrast to those found in the second table. The general difficulty common to all 3 of these commandments is that they're written in a way that suggests that they are not second-grade precepts of the natural law, which could be easily grasped even by an uneducated person. Instead, or indeed, they seem to be the sorts of precepts that could only be promulgated by divine revelation. And I have the actual text of the 3 commandments, but you have it in front of you on your handout there. So I'm just going to go through these. I won't be treating them in sequential order, but rather in order of ascending interpretive difficulty. So let's start with the 3rd commandment regarding Sabbath observance, because it's the easiest one to address. It's easiest because Aquinas considers the very objection that we might want to raise about this commandment as a precept of the natural law, and then he offers a very straightforward reply. So the objection is that the Sabbath commandment is not a moral precept at all, but rather a ceremonial precept. And this is what he has to say about that. This is in question 100, Article 3, response to objection 2. He says the precept of the Sabbath observance is moral in one respect, insofar as it commands a person to give some time to the things of God. In this respect, it is placed among the precepts of the Decalogue, but not as to the fixing of the time, in which respect it is a ceremonial precept. Thus, the Sabbath commandment is moral insofar as it prescribes our general duty to God as exercised through the virtue of religio, and as such, it is a precept of the natural law. Insofar as it appoints a specific day of the week and implies that there are specific ways to keep this day holy, as described in the various ceremonial laws of the Old Testament, well, the Sabbath commandment is ceremonial in that sense. So from this, we learn that it's possible for some commandments in the Decalogue to be understood as an expression of the natural law only when read or articulated in a certain way. And we need to remember that principle because it's going to help us as we consider the remaining 2 commandments of this first table. So now I'll turn attention to the first commandment. And Aquinas notes that it includes 2 precepts. Now, this is where the numbering is important, because if you are going with the numbering that you find in most Protestant traditions or other traditions, his argument doesn't work here. But he says the first commandment includes 2 precepts. Have no other gods before me, and make no graven images. He notes that some authorities that have come before him have numbered the commandments differently, but he's partial to Augustine's numbering of the commandments. He argues that Augustine more fittingly unites these 2 precepts in one command, quote, since the making of graven things or the likeness of anything is not forbidden, except insofar as they are being worshipped as gods. That's in question 100, article 4. In another article, he concedes that the precept, make no graven images, is counted among those that require divine instruction in order to be known, which may seem like a point in favor of what I've been calling the standard interpretation. But since this precept is only one part of the first commandment, Aquinas is able to affirm that even this commandment, when understood more narrowly, is a precept of the natural law that can be known apart from revelation. Okay, So that leaves us with the second commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And I have to say, this is the one that really got my students the most, because the comment was, how can you know through natural reason not to take the name of the Lord in vain? It's a fair question. And it's admittedly difficult to see how this commandment could be known through natural reason. How could a person use God's name in vain unless God's name had already been revealed to her? Moreover, Aquinas explicitly states that the precept, do not take God's name in vain, is among those that require divine instruction in order to be known. He does say that in one place. So maybe this whole project is over. Maybe the standard interpretation is right after all. Perhaps there's at least one commandment that requires divine instruction in order to be known. However, we should not forget the principle that we just identified a moment ago, namely that it is possible for some commandments in the Decalogue to be understood as expressions of the natural law only when articulated in a certain way. And this is the exact move that Aquinas makes in regard to the second commandment. He writes in question 100, Article 5, response to objection 3. He says, as the apostle says, he's quoting Hebrews here, people swear by one greater than themselves, and an oath for confirmation is the end of all their controversy. And then this is Aquinas' own words now. Thus, since oaths are common to all, inordinate swearing is the matter of a special prohibition by a precept of the Decalogue. So, in other words, he's saying that humans everywhere, not just the Jews, everywhere, practice oath-taking, and sometimes, oftentimes, they do so inordinately. And on this account, the natural law precept contained in the second commandment is simply, do not swear inordinately, which is a precept that can be known apart from divine revelation. So, to conclude, in my judgment, this is the only way to interpret Aquinas' claim that all the precepts of the Decalogue express the basic precepts of the natural law. The standard interpretation requires us to sever the first principles of the natural law, love of God and love of neighbor, and acknowledge their status as per se nota in fundamentally different ways, one by faith and one by natural knowledge. So the result then is that only the commandments of the second table of the Decalogue can be known through natural reason, which is a claim that Aquinas never makes. So as I've shown, there are solid textual grounds for believing that he denies this claim. And on my reading of Aquinas, the Decalogue does have a fundamentally religious character, but here we must be mindful of what Aquinas thinks it means to be religious. Under the heading of justice, religio describes the human being's duty toward God. So in the end, both tables of the Decalogue are expressions of the natural law, and all 10 commandments are fundamentally, in some way, about justice. Thank you.
Well, if there are questions for Stewart, you can. There is one there. 1 second.
I enjoyed your talk very much. While I don't necessarily disagree with you, I do want to play devil's advocate for a moment. So, our worldview, according to Christianity, is that I'm not sure if I'm cutting out here. Basically, the whole world ideally is supposed to convert to Christianity, even though we might not hold every individual culpable for not doing so. However, it is not seen by Jews that God obliges everyone to become Jewish, and I think this actually is a correct interpretation of Judaism down to the time of Christ. This was a way of life given to a particular people, and you did not need to belong to this particular people or be following these rules in order to know about God or in order to be a good person as God requires. And so the trouble I'm raising, it isn't that when I look at the 10 Commandments, I don't see the natural laws expressed to them, but the trouble is God gave to Moses these teachings which would be passed on just to one specific group of people until Christianity spread it further, but that's thousands of years in the future. So there is something very interesting in Jewish tradition, and that's that God gave a set of laws to Noah. Unfortunately, I don't remember the list, but I do remember that they seemed pretty intuitive and common sense. And I'm just wondering if there's something in that theory of trying to address that problem of why would God give these laws about these rules that regard the natural law just to one group of people, and maybe the answer was, well, actually, God did already give rules about the tradition about Noah, about the laws given to Noah, might not correspond exactly to the idea of the natural law, but I think there's some similarity there that might be seeking to answer that question, because the whole world is descended from Noah, unlike Moses.
Yeah.
So I just wondering if you have any thoughts.
I do. Thank you. And on the Noahide stuff, there's a theological ethicist named David Van Drunen who's done a lot of work on this. So if that's something anyone's interested in, I recommend his work. But you've asked a really important question, and it's kind of a big picture question. And I was actually hoping that somebody would ask some version of this question, because it gives me the opportunity to clarify something and be really clear about what I do and don't mean, or what I think the significance of this is and is not. So a lot of people, when they hear this kind of argument, they start to get nervous for similar reasons, because it sounds like we're sort of deflating the Decalogue and kind of making it just not special anymore. And that's, I think, a valid concern. And so what I want to be clear is that what I don't think Aquinas is doing is something like the trajectory that was initiated by Kant and the German Protestant tradition, we see carried on by folks like Harnack and so on, which is to say, well, if we read, the scriptures, especially, the Old Testament, we find these kind of like layers of additions and corruptions, but if we can really just use reason to get to the kind of the kernel, that's what's really important. And to kind of like come up with our own sort of standard based on reason alone that we can then use to kind of measure up scriptures and say, well, we can just kind of get rid of all the extra problematic stuff. That is not the reason or what's motivating the idea that the Decalogue can be understood as natural law here. So to think about the Decalogue as natural law is not to say, well, once we just can get that, then everyone should just follow that, and then it'll be simpler or better. But rather it's to say that these precepts, even though they're given to the Jewish people, they also in some way, reflect the mind of God that can be known to a lesser extent by all people. But as a kind of covenantal text, and that's why the wording is important. So let's take the Sabbath commandment, for example. It's better that in the scriptural text, it specifies a day, right? So that is actually more helpful to have a commandment that does specify the day. In other words, our project is not to kind of get rid of that extra stuff and strip it down to the studs, but rather to say it does reflect kind of, principles that can be known by reason alone. But then God uses it in this special covenantal relationship, and it's not just the Decalogue text; it's all of the precepts of the Old Law that are sort of summed up in the Decalogue. And by being a part of that covenantal relationship and by following those commandments, you are actually much closer to God than you ever could be with the natural law alone. So there's a lot more to say, but I appreciate the question.
Well, sadly, we have to finish this table and not the conference, because the last act is now at the Basilica, right? At 5:15. Thank you. Yeah.